Hello and welcome back to Gospel First. I'm your host, Joe Cirillo, and I'm grateful that you're here as we finish the week. As we begin, remember, the goal isn't to get through a chapter, it's to let a chapter get into us. 10 quiet minutes a day forms a steadier kind of faith. Today we're in Luke chapter 7, and it's a chapter full of tenderness. Faith that surprises Jesus, compassion that stops for grief, questions that come from dark places, and forgiveness that changes a person from the inside out. So if you're carrying sorrow or wrestling with doubts or need grace you can actually feel, today is for you. So let's begin. In Luke chapter 7, verses 1 to 10, it's about faith that Jesus calls great. Jesus enters Capernaum. A centurion sends word about a sick servant. And he says in verses 6, I am not worthy that thou should enter under my roof. Then he adds, verse 7, but say in a word, and my servant shall be healed. Jesus responds with amazement in verse 9. I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. Now this man trusts Jesus' authority without needing proximity. Faith here is humble confidence. So what's the principle? Great faith trusts Jesus' word without demanding control. Next, in verses 11 to 17, it's about compassion that stops a funeral. Jesus approaches the town of Nain. A funeral procession passes by, and Luke tells us in verses 12, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. Jesus sees her in verse 13. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her. And he says in verse 13, weep not. Then he touches the bier and commands in verse 14, young man, I say unto thee, arise. Well, Luke interrupts death. Jesus moves toward grief, not away from it. So here's something to think about. Where do I need Jesus to meet me in sorrow? And do I believe compassion still moves him to act? Next, in chapter 7, verses 18 to 23, it's about honest questions from a faithful prophet. John the Baptist, now in prison, sends a message. And they ask in verse 19, art thou he that should come? Or look we for another? Jesus does not rebuke the question. He points to the evidence in verse 22. The blind see, the lame walk, the poor have the gospel preached to them. Then he adds gently in verse 23, blessed is he whosoever shall not be offended in me. Faith here is allowed to ask questions, even from dark places. So what's the principle? God receives honest questions without withdrawing his grace. Next, in Luke chapter 7, verses 24 to 28, it's about more than a prophet. In verse 28, Jesus speaks about John. Among those that are born of women, there is not a greater prophet than John the Baptist. John prepared the way. He stood firm, and yet even faithful servants experience doubt and hardship. God honors faithfulness, even when it feels fragile. Next, in Luke chapter 7, verses 31 to 35, it's about missing the moment. Jesus compares the generation to children who refuse to respond. In verse 32, he says that we have piped unto you, and ye have not danced. Some reject John for being too strict, and others reject Jesus for being too gracious in verses 34. But Jesus concluded in verse 35, wisdom is justified of all her children. Truth is not proven, not by popularity, but by its fruits. So here's something to think about. Where might familiarity keep me from responding fully to Jesus Christ? And am I open to God's work even when it challenges my expectations? Next, in Luke chapter 7, verses 36 to 50, it's about the woman, about tears and forgiveness. Jesus dines at a Pharisee's house. A woman enters, known for her sin, and then she begins to weep. She began to wash his feet with tears in verse 38. The host judges her silently, and then Jesus tells a short parable about forgiveness in verses 41 to 42. Then he says, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much, in verse 47. And to the woman, thy faith hath saved thee. Go in peace, in verse 50. Love flows from forgiveness, not the other way around. So what's the principle? Those who know they are forgiven love deeply. So in closing, think about this. Luke chapter 7 reminds us Jesus notices humble faith. He stops for grief. He welcomes honest questions, and he forgives completely. If today you feel unsure or sorrowful or deeply aware of your need for grace, remember this. Jesus is not shocked by your questions. He is not repelled by your tears. And he never withholds forgiveness from a willing heart. Faith that trusts him and love that flows from grace still move his heart today. That wraps up week 7 of our 26-week study of the New Testament. Once again, thank you for staying faithful to the journey. May the Spirit continue to fill your heart and draw you closer to Jesus Christ. If your heart feels even a gentle nudge, I invite you to subscribe and share so that we can spread the gospel of Jesus Christ together. And I'll see you next week in week 8 as we continue walking through the New Testament with the book of Luke. Until then, God bless.